Best-selling author. I could talk to her every day. She cannot get enough daylight on the revelations that come out of her books. And wow, this moment in Epstein history and political American history and international history, it conforms perfectly with stuff she was talking about in one of her books that came out 5 years ago. She is just brilliant, and she joins us on Mondays. How about it for Sarah Kendzior, everyone? Thank you for being here, Sarah. You know I'm a huge fan, so it's always a treat for me to speak with you.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I want to talk about Hiding in Plain Sight, which was one of your books. And you talk about Epstein there, but it seems as though what's happening now truly overlays what you were talking about in that book in a almost block by block, molecule by molecule way. When you talk about the institutions of power, you talk about the elites. It's way beyond a Trump Epstein connection. It is so remarkably encompassing of these strata of society that are so very high. Can you spend a beat or two on that here and give folks a sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is why the book that I wrote after Hiding in Plain Sight was called They Knew, because they knew all of this crime, all of this abuse, all of this espionage, all of this elite criminal impunity. They knew this the whole time. And obviously, anybody with a library card could have taken out my book and read today's news 5 years ago. So while that's frustrating for me, the people who it's worst for are the people who were abused by Epstein and Maxwell and their operation, the victims who have been trying to tell their story, for well over a decade. One of whom tried to tell it a week before the 2016 election, only to receive violent death threats. Her lawyer did as well, so they canceled a press conference. But these women have been speaking out for an extremely long time. When Epstein allegedly died in 2019, there was this sort of outpouring of revelations about what he and Maxwell had been doing, about all of these elite actors implicated, including royalty, politicians, academics, people in the entertainment industry, and so forth. And at that point, I actually had a little bit of hope that we might see justice, that we might see more rigorous investigations, and these perpetrators would be taken down. I think a couple things happened. One was COVID arrived right after that, and kind of there was no other story but that. And then also, the Biden administration had no interest in pursuing any of these allegations, because it's not a partisan issue. It never ever was. It is both parties, and it is the most wealthy and powerful men in the world. And so they obviously have a great deal of control over this story, and always have.
Well, in fact, in They Knew, you talk about how Epstein was preceded by a bunch of others, and the institutions, if you will, that protected from scandal. It's not just all at Epstein's feet.
Oh yeah. I mean, I feel like their story is much bigger than what I've been able to dig up. What I talked about and they knew was mostly a man named Craig Spence, who operated during the 1980s during the Reagan administration. He seemed to have contacts with George Bush, the vice president then, and others. He was running a trafficking and blackmail operation with a lot of the same tactics that Epstein had. He'd have these fancy parties. He would have underage, boys and girls that he, solicited, not even kidnapped. I'm not going to beat around this, so that they could be raped and abused by the powerful. Then it seems like he blackmailed these powerful figures, and then he died very mysteriously in an alleged suicide with this strange note to made out to a chief. And that was after he was finally beginning to be seriously investigated and indicted for his crimes. And Congress is beginning to look at those crimes. And also paralleling Epstein, he used to be portrayed as a mysterious financier, a socialite, a center of the DC, high power social scene, same way as Epstein does, with his criminality completely played down down. And then, like Epstein, he dies in this mysterious way. And suddenly, all talk of him just ceases, because back then it was print media. And if you simply stopped printing the story would die out. With Epstein, it was different. They used to, just cut stories in that way. Now they have to drown them out with noise, with rumors, making it inscrutable, making it impossible to discern what's actually happening. And we went from having demands that were unmet for information to having an enormous amount of information come out very suddenly. All of these emails, and with more to come. I think that is a tactic that is meant to confuse people, meant to make people make memes instead of demand justice, and maybe even get so fed up and repulsed by the story that they abandon pursuit of the truth and of justice altogether.
That last point you make is so powerful. And you write about this. You write about sort of the disinformation machine and how even QAnon becomes part of this noise. And so that the facts and the essence of what's going on gets obscured by all of this other stuff.
Yeah, and they knew. I wrote about QAnon, and I stood up for QAnon, and I don't regret that. I stood up for the people in QAnon who were telling the truth about Epstein and Maxwell when the press would not, when Congress would not, because that was the problem with QAnon, is that they were members of it, people who aligned with it, were absolutely right about this story. And I would sometimes hear from people in that group who read my books, and then they would abandon Trump because they realized that there is a rape case involving Epstein and Trump, and they had no idea, because the press hadn't covered it. The unfortunate thing about QAnon is that they also believed a lot of things that were preposterous, untrue, libelous, smears, all sorts of irresponsible claims. So you had a very important actual conspiracy drowning in all of these lies and innuendo. And I felt bad for a lot of folks who attached themselves to that movement, because I think some of them were drawn to it out of genuine concern for the welfare of children. And I know there's probably people rolling their eyes as they say this, but I talked to them, and not everybody was some sort of giant Trump fan, or in a partisan cause. They really wanted children to not be abused, and that's something I think almost all Americans have in common, except for, of course, the Americans in our government and in our powerful corporate classes, which is a very frightening thing.
And I'm going to get to kind of where we are in this moment politically and with the information coming out in just a second. But I just want to follow up, because the QAnon thing I think is intriguing, because what you've just said essentially is that the conspiracy culture obscures and you write about this, this conspiracy culture obscures, unfortunately, some of the real bald-faced facts associated with this. So the essence of this, again, the facts are obscured by all this stuff that becomes distraction in this conspiracy culture.
Yes, and I think the clearest case of this was, so-called Pizzagate. There was beginning to be a lot of demands for more information about Epstein's relationship with Trump and with Bill Clinton around the time of the 2016 election. And shortly after that comes Pizzagate, which is a lie. It's this false claim that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile operation out of the basement of a pizza parlor. And what happened was, because so few Americans knew about Epstein, when they would hear this, when they would hear that there was this decades long operation of blackmailing, the wealthiest and powerful men in the world who were raping children, they thought it must be a lie, because clearly, if this was true, somebody would have done something about it. They didn't understand that the government and governmental institutions were, in fact, compromised in protecting it. But a lot of times when I would bring up Epstein, people would say, that sounds like Pizzagate. Like, that's Pizzagate kind of nonsense. And, they'd associate it, Pizzagate, with like Alex Jones and all these figures who have a reputation for lying and for propaganda. And I think that there's an element in the media who is so obsessed with seeming respectable, with seeming refined, that they didn't even want to delve into these stories, even though what was at the heart of them was abused children and also national security. And these are two things that everyone should be concerned with and not afraid to investigate. But they they thought it was beneath them. And I think that whoever designed Pizzagate as a propaganda strategy, and they knew, I call it preemptive narrative inversion, getting ahead of the Epstein story before it breaks into the mainstream, so that that's the first thing that comes to people's minds if they've never heard about it. Whoever did that, really understood how the DC and New York based press operated.
Yeah, this is so very much of the moment, because now it looks as though there will be stuff coming out. Stuff's coming out from the estate. We have emails from Epstein. You have the Michael Wolff statements that have taken on a little altitude. The idea somehow that you need to manage the narrative becomes super relevant. And you speak of this, and really, I think you're kind of a student of this in a way that links it to institutions of media, institutions of government, and I wonder if you could just speak to that. And institutions, not formally an institution, but the institution, if you will, of public consciousness. I wonder if you could just speak to sort of that.
Well, I think it's very interesting that Epstein, which is a case many of us have been demanding answers about for a decade, is suddenly being examined by Congress with all of this information released, when a few things have happened. Like, basically, all of our institutions have collapsed. The institution of Congress has. The DOJ is essentially a worthless entity that is just, Trump's stormtroopers. And before that, you had the useless Merrick Garland. The media has been drained. A lot of the websites where I initially learned about Epstein and Maxwell are gone. Their archives are gone. Things are paywalled. And most crucially, AI has been introduced. So my suspicion about what the most damning information and evidence is regarding Epstein has always been not that it is texts or emails, but that it is probably video. And I think we're at the point now where if video that is very damning and very disturbing is released, the first reaction is going to be, is this AI? Is this a real thing? Whereas just 2 years ago, certainly 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been impossible for a regular person without technological expertise to create a realistic looking fake video. Now it's very easy and anyone can do it. And so that takes away the ability to not create a narrative, but simply to present the truth and have people understand what happened. It allows for a lot of fakes, a lot of confusion, a kind of, terminal doubt. And I do worry that that's going to affect, the understanding of this case, and also who needs to be held responsible.
And so, cluttering the scene with some of this, everything from it's fake news, running down the media institutions was something that Trump has been doing for a long time. Now, ultimately, now there's been sort of media capture, I'd suggest, by the institutions that you write about. The wealthy, the elite, they are being granted essentially entrance into this media sphere in a way that is unprecedented. Although the scene was set for that control, and you write about this, for decades, right? The slow takeover of media by a handful of powerful people and by the elite. I mean, it's funny, Sarah, that Trump is this guy who rode in on a wave of populism. He kind of quacks this populist message, but it's the billionaires' boys club, and he's allowing sort of a sacking of the treasury. It leads with him to $230 million money grab for the aggrieved party that is Trump, having been persecuted by the Justice Department during his 4 years away. And now people like Michael Flynn getting $50 million. I mean, that's the negotiation. Michael Flynn, this guy should have absolutely no place. I believe he should have been stripped of his military pension. And here he is, he's going to get $50 million from you and me, and that's just part of it. Now there are legislators who are part of that J6 investigation. Their information was anonymized, okay? They didn't even have their names attached to it, just phone numbers to see if there was a call coming from literally inside the house to some of these people who were marauding the Capitol on January 6th. So all of these things happen. They are suing now. They want $500,000 apiece. There is this incredible money grab. I guess what I'm saying is that these institutions, all of them, from media to government, they are completely taken over by
Yes.
this jihad that's going on right now.
Yes, and this was the obvious thing that was going to happen if the Biden DOJ and Congress did not act during the 4 years that they had to. It was very obvious that Trump was going to come back and that he was going to do exactly this. And the same is true of his cohort. You know, you could tell that because he pardoned them all at the end, like they were getting set for a sequel. And with the sequel, it is no holds barred. And that's why it was so urgent and so important for Biden and Congress and Merrick Garland and the rest to act within that narrow window of time where the whole country was unified on the criminality of Trump. I mean, Trump is a career mobster associate. That's what he did his whole life. He played a tycoon on a reality show, but he's associated with criminals and also criminal attorneys, people like Roy Cohn, for his entire life. And he was never part of like a kind of ground up populist movement. He was the type designed by publicists, by places like Rubenstein PR, by people like Peggy Siegel. These are also the same people who managed Jeffrey Epstein and Jared Kushner and Rupert Murdoch and all of these other individuals. It is all, basically one group. When I was writing Hiding in Plain Sight, there were people who I wanted to mention who are in this that, I had a very strict legal vetting that I was kind of advised, don't put them in because they're going to sue. But, I just thought it was very interesting that, one of Trump's publicists at Rubenstein was Maggie Haberman from the New York Times, the prime person covering Trump. Her mother was handling Trump's publicity. And I was just thinking, well, that's an obvious conflict of interest. She's also handling Kushner's. There's this very kind of incestuous group of politics, media, and the New York FBI that worked in tandem to protect a lot of extremely shady and corrupt individuals, including Trump, Epstein, Giuliani. I mean, the list is quite long. And one of the things I think that's most damning is not just that there are so many perpetrators, but that there were so many witnesses. That's the problem. That's why Congress never wanted to deal with this, because no matter what administration you're dealing with, whether it's Biden, Trump, Bush, Obama, they all knew about Epstein at the least, even if they weren't part of it. They knew about it and they let it happen. And, they did nothing, and they did nothing to help the victims. They just sealed the cases and continued to make monetary deals with Epstein and his cohort, in many instances. And that, I mean, to do that after the indictments, like there's no possible excuse for that. And, I hope that is emphasized in the weeks to come, that level of complicity.
There is a sense that the narrative is becoming less controllable. So, like the last thing you say there, where you say, "I hope it comes out," I think uh, our notion as to what will come out is a tough one to nail down, and that's a good thing. I see more and more of this now as just kind of taking flight on its own, and and even you can see Trump with his reversal realized I can't hold the dam back anymore. There are cracks in my MAGA coalition. I'm seeing the people, and I'm even seeing politically the people turning on me. I'm going to have to allow for this momentum to continue. And so he's doing stuff like, which is, devilishly clever. I'm going to open up an investigation into Democrats. I'm going to have my Justice Department open up an investigation, even though he called it a Democratic hoax, or he called it a Democrat hoax. And in so doing, there'll be parts of this information that can't legally be released by my Justice Department because of an investigation going on. But still, Sarah, there is so much coming out from the estate, et cetera. It doesn't seem as though the narrative is truly controllable from anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically true. It reminds me, though, of 2019 in this regard, of August 2019, when there was such a domination of Epstein in the news, and then it kind of came to a halt. I mean, I think public interest is extremely high. I think it's much wider than it was before. This has always been an issue that all Americans were united on. There wasn't anyone rooting for Epstein and Maxwell versus others. If you knew about it, you were on the side of the abused, you were on the side of the victims. And I wrote, and they knew that, it really says a lot about America that this is what's holding us together as a country. But what it comes down to really is, who wields power, and who wields power now is Trump. And there has been very little effort from the Democrats or from the courts or from anyone to go up against him in a meaningful way, in part because he threatens to kill people who go against him. He has a whole cohort of goons, and also people who, they threaten excessive litigation. They attempt to ruin your life. But still, like, this is a known entity. This is someone who was first investigated by the DOJ in 1973. Like, they've had over half a century to get this done. Epstein was a known entity as well. And, the connections, one thing I find very interesting is that every administration seems to have several people directly connected to Epstein in a very personal way in there. You had Bill Barr, whose father hired Epstein as a high school teacher and brought him into New York high society. You had Tony Blinken, who was raised by Robert Maxwell's best friend. And also the last person who saw Robert Maxwell died, Robert Maxwell being Ghislaine Maxwell's father, and also someone who was originally, part of this transnational crime operation. Like, it's a very odd thing to me that he becomes Secretary of State under Biden, like, of all people. And, you had Alex Acosta also as the labor secretary under Trump. I mean, I could just go on and find Epstein connected people. Like, you could do 6 degrees of Epstein and it's like, the guy down the hall. Like, you don't have to look very far. And that's a disturbing thing. And I think that they purposely chose those individuals because they knew those people would never investigate Epstein, because it would mean investigating their own family members, their friends, their professional and social circles. Like, that was how they controlled this story.
Yeah, and it's not all, as you've said, the sex part. It's the connections to all the other stuff associated with Epstein. Tony, play me a little bit of the victims just for a second. I feel like I don't want to have a conversation about this without this. I thought this is powerful. This is a spot that came out, and here's just a clip from it, and you realize how young these people are.
14 years old.
I was 16 years old.
I was 16.
17.
14 years old.
Beyond the politics are Epstein's victims, still seeking some form of justice. Last night, some of them released this video, urging lawmakers to vote to release the files. Donald Trump has weathered many political storms before, but this is a story that won't go away. In giving the green light to release the files, he's hoping it finally will. But that, of course, depends on whether the files are quite as boring as he claims.
There is quite a bit of there's quite a bit of information that's already been released, as we've seen, and it's pretty damning. But wow, the international network that you describe in some of your writings, that's the connective tissue that I feel still has to be exposed.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's a network that spans many countries, the foremost countries. It's, the US, the UK, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And I think it's particularly interesting that, some have been surprised about the Republicans, the few of them that have demanded that the Epstein information be fully released. They're the same Republicans that are not taking money from AIPAC, because Israel is really the elephant in the room. It's, a primary funder of Congress through AIPAC. They wield an enormous amount of influence. And, Epstein was closely working with Israel. And of course, Robert Maxwell was an operative for Israel. He had a grand state funeral after he died, after mysteriously falling off a yacht in 1991. And, they were thanking him for his service to the country. And this is a career criminal. He was a publishing magnate, but he was associated with, the Russian mafia. He was, up to all sorts of, dirty deeds. And this was known at the time. And so that's the issue. When someone talks about Robert Maxwell and they bring him into this conversation, I tend to think they're an honest broker in discussing Epstein. If they're leaving that whole history out, a history that really seems to stem from Iran-Contra and the circle surrounding Iran-Contra more than anything else, then I tend to think they're not particularly serious about this, because you see arms traders, people like Adnan Khashoggi, this kind of rotating series of characters. And then you see, of course, people who were murdered later, like Jamal Khashoggi. It's the same names, the same countries, and they're showing up again and again. And that's why I do feel like there are a lot of different levels to this story, but but when you're seeing so many familiar places, like another example would be Deutsche Bank, being a financial entity used over and over, then you need to examine that trail. And there's so much of this that there's no way it could all be in one book, or one investigation, but it's been buried for so long, and that's the result. But I think that trying to put those puzzle pieces together and figuring out who really controls the US government and who even controls this criminal operation, because I don't think Epstein was the head of it. I think he was a major figure within it, but I don't necessarily think he's the person running it. And I wonder a lot about Russian mafia operations like the one by Semyon Mogilevich, which is basically never brought up, even though that is, who Robert Maxwell was working with. And also a number of people who worked for Mogilevich ended up working side by side with Trump through Bayrock and through other organizations. So that's all something that should be covered, but basically
well, I mean, and the money trail does go back to Russia in addition to other places, and the capture of major banking institutions through whatever way Epstein had. Was it blackmail or whatever? But they're huge banking executives, as you know, are brought down in the scandal as well. So yeah, there's way more to be told here, but I'd suggest it was foretold in some measure, and it was laid bare in a couple of your books, and we'll have links to them under this conversation as always. I'm out of time really, but I didn't want the entire conversation to go away without touching on what I think is a huge winner politically, should there ever be another real election in America, should there ever really be another shot at a change of power, and that is corruption. I alluded to it earlier in this conversation in relation to the power grab on the part of Donald Trump, the $230 million, the $50 million from Flynn. I thought it particularly grotesque when I saw the Swiss who were trying to get out from under these withering tariffs that Donald Trump, again, impulsively imposed upon the Swiss. They brought him in the conversation and negotiation with them. They brought him a gold bar with, I think it was inscribed in some, maybe with his name. I forget. I think it did have his name on it. There was, literal graft and grift going on in the White House. And then the president removes the tariff from the Swiss, the heavy tariff, so it's back down to 15% or whatever it was, off of the 40% it was prior to the conversation. The total corruption of this administration on every level, from the Argentina bailout, which is associated with Besant and the Billionaire Boys Club, hedge funders who were buying in Argentina and needed to prop up that government, to, as I say, the graft and grift associated with this Swiss gift. Give me a moment on this. I feel like more should be made of this. Somehow it's getting lost in the smoke.
Yeah, I never understood why the Democrats didn't. Well, I did understand, I guess, but the Democrats should have ran as an anti-corruption party first and foremost, and they couldn't because they themselves are corrupt. That is why they are taking dirty money, dark money, money from sanctioned Russian oligarchs that are then given to proxies to make it legal to deposit it into campaigns, dirty money from Silicon Valley. But, this is a kleptocracy. America is a kleptocracy, and that means ruled by thieves. And that is something that Americans, regardless of their political party, they will not put up with. Nobody wants to be ruled by thieves. They'll allow bigotry. They'll allow just being a jackass. Like all sorts of things can get by. No one wants to be stolen from. No one wants to be ripped off. No one wants to see the treasury looted. No one wants to see disgusting child raping oligarchs being rewarded. So yeah, this is a very unifying thing. But the problem is there are very few in Congress who kind of live up to their word, have a sincere interest in protecting the American people from this. One final note, there's a very interesting speech by, of all people, Robert Mueller, called The Evolving Organized Crime Threat, where he talked about organized crime and kleptocracy as what was most likely to bring America down. And he gave this speech in 2011 and then proceeded to do basically nothing to stop it. But his point is that high level elite kleptocracy affects the average American person. It affects how much things cost. It affects your ability to just, live your life unimpeded. So it's not an abstract issue. It is what the Democrats like to call a kitchen table issue. So their avoidance of it for so long under that excuse is just facetious. That is not a legitimate reason to ignore elite, billionaire corruption.
The only person I heard on the Democratic side, this is back in 2015, And I was so excited that she was talking about this, and I really felt like we had a chance with this conversation. The only person I saw and heard mention corruption was Elizabeth Warren.
Yes.
She mentioned it prominently. I mean, I would start and end every conversation with corruption. This is, but as you say, you know, nobody's got a clean account here, which is the tough part. I mean, everyone's so compromised who may be blowing the whistle on corruption that, you know, you end up just going with the, oh, they're all corrupt, the same way you lose track of the facts in all the disinformation. But I'd love to talk to you more about that, maybe for the next time or in a future conversation. Links to all of Sarah's books under this conversation, they're all gifts. And you could almost needle drop them, just open and enjoy. I mean, and enjoy the ride through real facts and wonderful information and stories really well told. Again, super treat to talk to you always. Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Sarah Kendzior, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.